that entire generation never made it into the promised land, and they did not make it into the promised land because of the way they thought. Their thinking was the very thing that hindered them. Their thinking kept them from the great thing God had in store for their lives. They saw themselves a certain way. They had what we might call stinking thinking, negative thinking, thinking of unbelief, thinking of mistrust of God, and so because of that, they missed their future. Dear ones, how you think is very important, because how you think can mess up your future. How you think can hinder you from experiencing all that God has in store for your life if you're not careful. That's one of the areas where the devil traffics in all of our lives. If he can mess up your thinking, he can mess up your future. If he can mess up the way you view God, as we'll talk about in a moment, he can mess up everything that God has planned for you. If he can mess with the way you think about yourself, or the way you think about others, or the way you think about the world around you, if he can mess with your thinking, he can rob you of your future. Let's look at another story, and that story is of a man by the name of David. You know the story of David and Goliath. It's found in 1 Samuel chapter 17. If you'd like to read that this week, it's a great read, great story that unfolds for you. Let me tell you a little bit of the story, and then we'll look at a few verses, and let's talk again about perspective. Okay? By the way, in this story, two men had the right perspective. Their names were Joshua and Caleb, and they ended up going into the promised land. They made it because they had the right way of thinking. Now let's go to David for a moment. Here's the story. At this particular time in Israel's history, 1 Samuel chapter 17, the Israelite army was facing a battle with the Philistine army. And the Philistines were trying to take captive the Israelites under the leadership of Saul. And so they decided to do it this way. We're gonna set up a battle, and we've got this guy on our team, the Philistines said. His name is Goliath. He was a giant. The Bible says he was over 9 feet tall. And so here was the proposition. Goliath would come out and he would intimidate the armies of Israel, and he would say, if there's just one person there that's willing to come and fight me, we'll fight it out mano a mano. There'll be a one battle deal, and whoever wins the battle wins the victory. And so day after day, this big giant came out and intimidated Israel, all the armies of Israel, trying to get one of the guys to come and fight him, and no one would, because the Israelite army was caught up in great fear and intimidation of Goliath. There was a certain day when a man by the name of Jesse, who had some sons in the army, had also a son at home, decided to send that son from home to check out his sons who were in the army, to take them some food and see how they were doing. And that boy at home was named David. And Jesse, the father, came to David and said, hey son, I want you to go to the place where the Israelites are in this battle with the Philistines, and I want you to go check on your brothers and see how they're doing, and here's some bread and cheese that I want you to deliver to them, and come back and give me a report of what's happening there in that situation. And so David walks onto the scene of this battleground, and he sees what's going on. Every day for about 6 weeks, Goliath was coming out, 40 days, and he was intimidating the armies of Israel, and every time it would happen, Israel's army would run away from the battle in fear. And David watched this, and something inside of him said, this is not the way it should be. There's something wrong with this picture. Take a look at what happens here. David asked the men standing near him, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? So this is a disgraceful situation. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Take a look at what happens next. David said to Saul, who by the way was the king, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. So now David, he's the shepherd boy. He's there simply to deliver some food and to get some messages, but he steps up to the situation and says, I'm going to go and fight him. Notice what happens next. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand, approached the Philistine. This is a very important word, because all of the other soldiers of Israel, instead of approaching the Philistine, they were running away from the Philistine. So now you see all of Israel running in fear, but David moving forward in faith. Big difference, right? I'll tell you why. The reason that this is different for David was his, here's the word again, his, say it with me, perspective. Say it with me. It was his perspective. All the soldiers from the army of Israel,